The Java try with resources construct helps you close resources correctly, which have to be closed manually after use. For instance, a file or a file input stream or a network connection like a database connection. In this video, I will explain to you how the Java try with resources construct works. And as you can see from this screenshot here, I also have a textual version of this tutorial. And I have linked to that tutorial in the description below this video. Let's jump right into the code and see how the try with resources construct looks. And I have already created an example here to save a little bit of time. As you can see, there's a try block here. And after that, we have a set of parentheses. And inside the parentheses, we can declare any resources that we want the try with resources construct to handle for us. And by handle, I mean automatically close when the try block exits. Inside this try block here, inside the parentheses, I have declared a file input stream variable, and I have instantiated a new file input stream object here. And inside the try block, I'm reading all the data from this file input stream, and then when the code exits the try block here, the try with resources construct will automatically close the file input stream for us. Before Java 9, the resources that you want to close or you want actually automatically closed by a try with resources construct had to be declared inside the parentheses here after the try block. But from Java 9, it is actually possible to declare them outside. But you just need to reference them inside the try with resources parentheses. I will show you how that works. Look at this. First, we move this variable out here, outside of the try block, and then we can just reference it like this. Now it works, but this only works from Java 9 and forward. There's one restriction on the resources that you can reference inside the parentheses of a try with resources construct, and that is that the resource must be, the variable must be effectively final, which means that this variable out here must be assigned once, but after assignment it must not be changed again later on. For instance, so you're not allowed to do something down here, for instance, is new is equal to some other file. As you can see then up here, the compiler complains that this is no longer effectively final because we are actually reassigning the file input stream variable down here. But by removing this reassignment, the file input stream variable actually becomes effectively final, and we are allowed to reference it inside the try with resources parentheses here part here. For now, to keep the examples simple, we will just move the resource declaration directly inside of the try with resources block here. It makes the code a little bit simpler. The try with resources construct can handle, can manage, can automatically close any resource or any object that implements the auto-closable interface. And it's actually possible for us to implement this interface ourselves in case we have resources that we want to be able to be managed by the try with resources construct. And I just want to show you how this looks. It's actually very simple. So I create a new class here. I make it implement the auto-closable interface. You can see it's in the Java lang folder. It's a core interface. And as you can see, it only has a single method called close, and which can throw an exception when you attempt to close the resource. If you create a class that implements this interface, you can use it inside of the try with resources construct, and I will show you that here. Right? Let's just do it down here. Try auto-closable example resource is equal to a new auto-closable example, and you can see now in here we can use the resource, and then once the execution exits this block here, exits the try block, then the try with resources construct will automatically call this close method for us here. So let's try and just put in a little system out here so we can see this actually works. Let's just try to comment out this up here so we don't get bothered by that. Let's try to run this example and see what we get out in the terminal here. Look at that. Auto closable example closed is printed out because after this try block here exits, the try with resources construct calls our close method here. Quite useful, right? The try with resources construct can actually handle more than one resource for us at a time. So let's just try to see how that looks. First of all, I just remove this old example up here. So what we will do here is I will simply declare another resource in here, which also implements the auto closable interface. And as you can see, I'm using the exact same class and I'm separating the declarations with a semicolon here, with a semicolon. So now the try with resources construct will handle the closure of both resource and resource 2 for us. And if we run this, you will see that we will have this text printed out twice now because we have 2 resources that will be closed for us. And that's just as you can see, just like we expected, we get the text printed out twice. One little detail to notice is that when we are letting the try with resources construct handle multiple resources, the order in which the resources are closed is the reverse order of which they are declared up here in the parentheses. That means that when the resources are closed, when the try block exits, first the resource 2 will be closed and then resource will be closed. And we cannot see that in the output down here because the 2 instances print out the exact same text when they are closed. But in later examples, I will show you that this will become clear because the close methods will print out different texts. The exception handling semantics of the try with resources construct are slightly different than what you might be used to from the try, catch, finally blocks. So we will have a look at that here towards the end of this video. To demonstrate the exception handling semantics of the try with resources construct, I have created a special auto-closable resource which implements the auto-closable interface. The auto-closable resource can be configured to throw an exception either when you call close, which corresponds to an exception happening when you close the resource, or you can tell it to throw an exception when you call do up by passing true as parameter to the method here, which corresponds to an exception happening when you are using the resource. Let me first show you how this works by simply going back to the try with resource example here and replace the auto-closable example resource here with the auto-closable resource which I just showed you. So I will call this 1 and I will tell it by passing false that it should not throw an exception when we close it, and I will do the same to the second resource here. We'll just call this up here resource 1, and this we will also turn into a auto-closable resource, and the name will be two, and I will also tell this one not to throw any exceptions when you close it. Now let me also just show you how to actually use these resources here. I will call resource 1.doUp, and I will pass false as parameter, and I will do the same to resource 2. And by passing false to the do-up methods, I'm telling the resource not to throw an exception when this method is called. In order to verify that there are no exceptions thrown from this code, I will just execute it here so you can see the output down here, and you can see first it's printing out resource 1 doing operation, which is printed from this first do-up call here, and then it's printing resource 2 doing operation, which is printed from inside this method call down here on resource 2. Then you can see resource 2 is being closed and resource 1 is being closed, and as I have explained earlier, the resources here are closed in the opposite, in the reverse order of which they're declared here. So that means that resource 2 is closed first, as you can see, and then resource 1 is closed. Now let's try to configure the first resource to throw an exception when do-up is called, and we do that by simply changing the parameter value here to true. And then let's run the code again and see what happens. As you can see, resource 1 operation is being called, but resource 2 do-up is never called, because when an exception is thrown from this method, the code in the block is of course aborted. It's the try block is exited. But as you can see, both resource 2 and resource 1 are still closed. And you can also see that from the try block, the exception that was thrown in here is propagated out, and it's throwing out to the Java runtime, which then just prints it out so we can see it here. But as you can see, let me just repeat that even though the resource here is throwing an exception when we call it, both resources are being closed correctly. Now let's see what happens if I am also configuring the resource to throw an exception when it is closed, right? So I'd simply change this parameter to true, and I run it again. And as you can see, we get the same behavior as before. Resource 1 operation is being called, but resource 2 do-up is not called because an exception is thrown from this method still. That breaks the code flow, the code execution of the try block. And then when the execution exits the try block, it will try to close the resources. And as you can see, it first tries to close resource 2, which succeeds just fine. And then it tries to call to close resource 1, which then fails. Now we have 2 exceptions being thrown from this try block. So which one will actually be the one propagated up to the call stack? And the answer is that it is the exception thrown in here when using the resource that is propagated out of the try block, even though another exception is thrown when trying to close the resource or one of the resources here. And the reason for that is that most likely the exception from using the resource is more interesting to you. It is the root cause, and it so it's more interesting to you as an application, but also as an application developer, that this is the one you should be looking at handling. And also this exception might be the one causing also the failure when trying to close the exception. Of course not in this case, because this is the configuration that is causing it, but in the case in the case of a real resource, for instance, a database connection, if you try to call an operation on a database connection that has gone stale, then that might throw an exception. And then when you try to close the database connection, that might fail too, because the database connection is still stale. But when you look at the exception down here, you can see that it has changed, because what has happened is that this exception thrown from in here is caught by the Java runtime, and then the exception that was thrown when trying to close the resource up here, or not up here, but like because I configured it here, but from the close call, is attached to the first resource as what is called a suppressed exception. And we will have a little bit a closer look at suppressed exceptions in just a second. In order to see how these suppressed exceptions work, I will add a catch block to the try with resources block here. So this will catch all the exceptions that are thrown. And then first of all, I will just print out the exception and its stack trace. And then I will call e.getSuppressed. e.getSuppressed returns an array of throwables. And this array will contain any suppressed exceptions that this other exception up here might contain. And now I will print them out, or print out the suppressed array. And let's actually try to run this, but with a debugger, and see what happens. As you can see, an exception was thrown from in here, which causes the code in the try block to exit or to break. And then we enter the catch block because an exception was thrown. But before we enter the catch block, you can see that Java has already closed or attempted to close our two resources. That means that by the time the code enters the catch block, the resources are already closed. And as you can see, when we go back into the debugger, because another exception is thrown, I configured it to be thrown when resource 1 is closed, you can see that the array here actually contains another suppressed resource, or another suppressed exception. And that is the exception that occurred when Java was trying to close the resource for us. In case more than one exception is thrown when trying to close resources, then all of the exceptions that occur when trying to close resources will be present in this throwable array here, in the suppressed array. And I can demonstrate that simply by changing the statement or the parameter up here to true. Now both of the resources will throw an exception when you try to close it. And then we simply rerun the example in the debugger. Now you can see the suppressed array contains two exceptions because two exceptions were thrown when trying to close the resources here. Okay, so now you should have a pretty good understanding of how exception handling works with the try with resources construct. And so just one final thing that I want to show you. Let me just stop this example here. And that is what happens if we have a finally block on. Obviously, before we even enter the finally block, the try with resources construct will also have tried to close our resources. And let me just demonstrate how that works. Let's first remove the exceptions here, and also remove the exception here. So now this will just run through without any problems. But we will have a look at the console output. As you can see, first we call resource 1 do up, we call resource 2 do up, and then we close the two resources, and then the finally clause is executed, right? You can see the output is coming down here. So when we enter the finally clause, the resources have already been closed for us. The exception handling semantics of the finally clause are slightly different than they are from the rest of the try with resources block, in that exceptions thrown from the finally block are normally not will normally shadow for any exceptions thrown earlier. But in order to demonstrate this, let me just put this into a method like this. Okay, I call this work on resource, which may throw an exception. It's not doing that right now, but I will make it do that in a moment. Let's just throw e out. So this is kind of simulating that I'm catching the exception, maybe doing some logging or whatever, and then I rethrow the exception to break the execution flow all the way up the call stack. And then down here in finally, I will also simulate that something happened that that causes an exception to be thrown. Now let me also just wrap the call to work on resource inside a try catch block up here, so we can see what exceptions are propagated out of the work on resource method. And like this, and then we will ask it to print the stack trace out. Now let's try to run this example here and see what exception is thrown out of the work on resource method. So I run it with the debugger. And when we inspect the exception down here, you can see that it is actually the exception from finally, which is caught up here. Now, this is not surprising, because at the moment we have configured the resources not to throw any exceptions when they are closed, nor when you call the do operation. So let's just change that. We will have both of them throw exceptions when they are closed, both of the resources, and then we will have this first resource also throw an exception when do is called. Now let's rerun the example and see what exception is caught up here. And look at that. When you look at E down here again, it's still the exception from finally that is caught. And when we look at the suppressed exceptions stored inside of it, they are the list is empty. There are no suppressed exceptions in this exception here. And that demonstrates that in case you throw an exception from the finally block of a try with resources construct, then suppressed exceptions or exception thrown earlier from the try block, or suppressed exceptions when closing the resources, or any exceptions thrown from within the catch block, they are all shadowed or ignored. They disappear, so you're not able to see them anymore. So be aware of that if you decide to add a finally block to your try with resources construct, and if that finally block can throw exceptions. That is all that I have to show or to demonstrate about the Java try with resources construct. As mentioned earlier in this video, there's a link to a textual version of this tutorial in the description below the video. And I also have a lot more tutorials on my website on tutorials.genkov.com.